before I get too deep into some of the particulars, let me just stop and say, again, what did Trump say here? He said, the CEO of Intel is highly conflicted and must resign immediately. There is no other solution to this problem. Thank you for your attention to this problem. Okay, so there is absolutely no wiggle room there. There is no way for the Trump supporter to get out of saying either A, the US government now just teamed up with a company that's being run by somebody whose loyalties are with the Chinese and not us. And so that's kind of weird. Like, why would we want to team up with someone like that? Why would we want to do business with somebody who's giving military secrets to China? Why would we do that? That's kind of poor judgment. Not sure how that's a win for the taxpayer. Or what presumably is the actual answer is that when Trump said this, he either was ill-informed or he was lying.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I am going to be speaking about the recent Trump administration move to acquire 9.9%, you may have seen it rounded to 10% in popular media, share of holdings in Intel, chip manufacturer, and the broader implications of that, and as Howard Lutnick and others have talked about, perhaps moving beyond that. And I'm also going to then connect it to some of my earlier remarks in regards to a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And so the long and short of it is, I gave a qualified defense when the idea was first floated and continued to be discussed about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I didn't say that was necessarily, government fascism and meddling in markets and things like that. But the recent Intel move and then the commentary around it from Trump administration officials, alarms me greatly. And so I think I'm in a qualified position to level a critique of that because I'm not just a knee-jerk anti-Trumper, right? I'm not just someone who hates everything that, Orange Man bad does. And so I do want to just discuss some of those issues. So first, let me remind you folks, this will be a review for those who have been a long time InFi listeners, as to the qualified defense I gave for the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So a lot of my libertarian colleagues were just, aghast at the idea and said, oh, what, was this a Trump administration officials are going to be running a hedge fund on the taxpayer behalf? That's crazy. If you want to buy Bitcoin, go buy Bitcoin yourself. And sure, that's true if the rationale for a strategic Bitcoin reserve had been, oh, this will be profitable and we'll just give a return to the taxpayer. And so you'll be thanking us down the road when Bitcoin shoots up, right? If that were the full justification or rationale given for, I'll just call it SBR for brevity's sake now, Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, then yes, I would agree that's not a good idea. You don't need government officials investing taxpayer dollars on their behalf. If people want to get into Bitcoin, they can do that themselves. Like cut everyone's taxes and let them decide what they want to do with it, right? That's what I would have said. But there were other rationales that could be given. And so what I said, for example, is right now, central banks around the world hold foreign exchange reserves, and they also hold a bunch of gold. Ostensibly, at least on paper, the US government is the single largest institutional holder of gold on planet Earth. Okay, people speculate that maybe some of those numbers are phony, but it is what it is. Okay. And so my point was, if you think that Bitcoin is not simply another asset that happens to have a high rate of return, backward looking, arguably the best performing asset in human history. But if you think it's more than that, if you think it's at the very least a money-like asset, or as some proponents believe, you think that down the road eventually Bitcoin will become the preeminent reserve asset of the planet, well then it's perfectly straightforward that central banks / central governments would get into that asset. So for an analogy, I don't know that I ever said this before, but it occurred to me, when the euro was introduced, right, it replaced all of the existing sovereign currencies of Europe, or at least the participating countries, right? So prior to the euro, there had been the French franc, the German mark in its various iterations after the hyperinflation in the interwar period, and so on, right? Italian lira. And those all got phased out when the euro was introduced because now they were all using a common currency. And so the US authorities began stockpiling reserves of euros, whereas obviously that wasn't true in 1975. The euro didn't exist back then. And so I think it would have been silly for libertarian ideologues to object when the euro was first introduced if the Fed and then the Bank of England and Bank of Japan and so on began acquiring a stockpile of euros or government sovereign debt denominated in euros, that sort of thing. It would have been silly to object to that and say, oh, that's socialism or fascism. What you do, you don't want government meddling in private property markets and currencies. That's not really what's going on there. Given that central banks are going to exist, it makes sense that they would hold assets denominated in the major other currencies of the world, right? And there's various reasons for why they do that. It's partly hedging, or it's better to think of it as hedging rather than speculation. They're not doing it in order to hopefully earn a decent rate of return on their portfolio of foreign currencies and then return that via remittances to the treasury to ultimately the taxpayer. That's not what's going on there. Okay. So given that analogy, then I'm saying, all right, if you think that Bitcoin is steadily becoming comparable to gold, digital gold, and many people do think that, and I think that, then in that context, in that framework, it's not crazy to float the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Okay. And also, too, there were all sorts of matters of what you might call political economy in terms of wiser and more foolish ways of setting up an SBR if you wanted to go down that path. And I wrote op-eds and I think did at least one episode of InFi on that topic, right? To explain, because you don't want the government to then have a lot of sway over the markets. So I was saying you want to really codify what the rules are in terms of how long are you going to acquire. If you do, certain triggers are hit and you start selling off some of it, what are the uses that the funds can be put to, and how do you determine how much you sell? Because you didn't want to leave all that up to the officials in charge of managing the SBR in some future administration, because then they're going to have a lot of arbitrary power over the financial sector. Okay, and so I was saying you want to codify all that stuff up front if you're going to go down that path, but I was not against the idea of an SBR per se, even though in general I don't even like central banks. I recently was on a zero hedge debate saying we should get rid of the Federal Reserve, but I understand given that the Fed exists, it's going to have 4x reserves, and it's not crazy for the Fed to hold some Bitcoin in that capacity, or to have, the federal government be the custodian and so forth. Okay, so having said all that, and then also another thing I just remembered, I have been a qualified supporter of the recent Genius Act regulating stablecoins. And my quick takeaway there is I can argue with some of the provisions. I can be very cynical perhaps about why some of those provisions ended up in it. But in terms of stablecoin, a framework for stablecoin regulation, yes or no, given that the SEC and all these institutions are going to exist, well, yeah, it's better to give a roadmap so people know if we're going to build, this is how we do it. And the final thing I'll say is I was delighted not only that Trump beat Kamala Harris in the recent election in the US, but that he said he wanted the US to be the crypto and AI capital of the world. Okay, that's all music to my ears, and certainly was wind behind our sails for what we're doing here at Infineo. We're putting life insurance on the blockchain. Okay, so now that I've gone through all that, I'm partly doing this in case some people are stumbling on this video who aren't familiar with my background. I now want to proceed to say the stuff with taking over 10% share of Intel and the circumstances under which that happened are very alarming. Okay, and so for one thing, I'm not one to engage in hyperbole on this stuff, but that's literally the definition of fascism, right? Not in terms of oppressing certain racial minorities or things like that, which is usually what people mean by the term, or even just a crackdown on civil liberties. But no, it's government business partnership. It's saying, oh, we don't let just private companies do what's in their narrow self-interest in terms of their return to their shareholder, but they have to act for the good of the nation as a whole, or one big family, as it were. And I'm saying that's a key component of fascism, and that's partly what the fascist theorists, that's why they didn't like old school classical liberalism, because they thought it was very atomistic and it was like every man for himself. And that's not a noble vision. everybody should throw in their lot for the common good, including big corporations. And that's why they should form partnerships with the government. Okay, so I'm saying, even though people throw the F word around about Trump a lot, this is an example. And especially when you would hear commentary from, like the Commerce Secretary defending the Intel deal and then saying how we've got, there's more where that came from. Now somebody wants to say, hey, technically that's fascism. I'm on board with that. That's not hyperbole. Okay, but besides just the labels and the terminology, let's get more specific about what are the issues. So I think some people might not be aware that this deal didn't happen in a vacuum. Intel has been doing poorly, and they actually replaced their old CEO for poor performance and named the new one, Lip-Bu Tan, back in March. Okay, so the current Intel CEO is new on the job. He was just installed back in March. And then as people were looking into his background, he had various ties to either through his personal investments or in his work capacity in terms of his job experience, working with had various connections to the Chinese military. Okay. I have not done enough investigation of that to know or to say with any degree of confidence whether those suspicions are warranted or not. I truly am not being coy. I just haven't looked enough into it. So for all I know, it could range from, this is completely ridiculous, overblown claims with no validity, or the guy could be an outright spy, right? I really don't know anywhere on the spectrum of where it's likely to end up. But Senator Tom Cotton, among others, was raising alarms about this. And then Trump, as recently as, this was August 7th, so we'll flash this up on the screen if you're watching the video version. On Truth Social, Trump put out this post that says, the CEO of Intel is highly conflicted and must resign immediately. There is no other solution to this problem. Thank you for your attention to this problem! Exclamation point. Okay, so that was August 7th. And then it was like 2 weeks later that all of a sudden the Trump administration and Intel announced this deal whereby the federal government now owns 9.9% in a passive ownership stake in Intel. And it's up, then they're hailing it as a great move for the taxpayer and it's good for U.S. defense preparedness and blah, blah, blah. So before I get too deep into some of the particulars, let me just stop and say, again, what did Trump say here? He said, the CEO of Intel is highly conflicted and must resign immediately. There is no other solution to this problem. Thank you for your attention to this problem. Okay, so there is absolutely no wiggle room there. There is no way for the Trump supporter to get out of saying either A, the US government now just teamed up with a company that's being run by somebody whose loyalties are with the Chinese and not us. And so that's kind of weird. Like, why would we want to team up with someone like that? Why would we want to do business with somebody who's giving military secrets to China? Why would we do that? That's kind of poor judgment. Not sure how that's a win for the taxpayer. Or what presumably is the actual answer is that when Trump said this, he either was ill-informed or he was lying. Okay, so either any three of those, it has to be one of those three. And no matter what the answer is, it's not good. And you should not be happy that if Donald Trump is your guy, that he took us down this path. Okay, and I think the very best case you could make is to say, oh, Trump just smelled blood in the water and he saw the opportunity for a deal, so he leveraged this. Yeah, he knew the guy wasn't really a Chinese spy or something, or wasn't conflicted, and he was just doing this. Come on, Trump makes over-the-top statements all the time. You don't take him literally, you take him seriously. And then this is what got the guy to fly to Washington, got Intel very serious about negotiation with it, and then look at this great deal. You can go through all that, but at the end of the day, you're still left saying what you think, and that's the best spin you can put on this whole scenario. What you think happened is there were bogus allegations floating around about the leader of a semiconductor manufacturer. The president of the United States knowingly demanded something that he didn't actually want, said knowingly false things about it in order to then acquire a large chunk of the shares in this company. And say what you will about that, but that is not the way to make the U.S. the AI and crypto capital of the world. that type of behavior by the president of the United States does not make me, if I'm a CEO, want to locate my company in this jurisdiction. If I know that kind of thing can happen, and that's the best case scenario, that the worst case scenario or the inferior case scenarios would be, oh yeah, Trump wasn't lying when he said that. That guy really is shady. He really is, tied to the Chinese military. But we've looked at the details and realized, oh, it would be better to keep this company up and running as long as we get a share of the profits. Like, no, that doesn't work. Okay. Or just that, yeah, the guy flew to Washington, showed Trump, they straightened things out, they came to an understanding. It turns out, yeah, the guy wasn't conflicted. When Trump said there's no other solution to this problem, actually what he really meant was there's an obvious solution is that we get 10% stake in the company. That's the other solution besides him stepping down. Yeah, I misspoke. Why would that instill confidence? If the president of the United States is capable of that kind of mistake, again, I don't want my shareholders, my company, anywhere near that kind of a regime, if that's what happened, right? So again, my point is if a large part of MAGA and all these smart deals and Trump surround himself with business people, finally for once, we got people who know how capitalism works and what made this country great. We're going to bring jobs back. All that stuff that people would be using to try to justify some of these policies. I'm saying you're shooting yourself in the foot with this kind of behavior, that you would be crazy on this score alone to want your company to be vulnerable to this kind of shakedown. Okay, but it gets worse. All right, when I first heard the details of the deal, I assumed that, oh yeah, I know Intel has been losing market. And if you don't know, even though Intel is like the household name in this area, and you might think it's sort of like what IBM used to be. There was a time in US history when IBM was just this behemoth, and they even, were bringing antitrust suits against it and whatever, because, oh my God, how could nobody can compete with IBM? It's funny now as I say that, but yet that used to be the thinking. The same thing with Intel, that there was a period where that just, yeah, you needed chips, you go to Intel, but they actually have been getting crushed in the market for AI. Like there's these large language models which run on GPUs, not CPUs, graphical processing units that are better designed to run in parallel. Okay, so there's that element. And then even though for like the home computer market, my understanding is that even there, Intel has been losing market share rapidly. Okay, so it just has not been doing it. And again, their CEO, the new one, was put in March because the last guy they canned, that he wasn't performing well. Okay, so what I had thought when I first saw some of the details of this deal was that, oh, okay, so this is just corporate cronyism, the household name that's got a lot of political connections. They're losing market share to these upstart competitors, some of which could be foreign firms so that aren't as connected, especially with the Trump administration now. Has a lot of people born and raised in the United States, successful business people. And so, yeah, I could just see a good old boy network and U.S. tax dollars were injected into this company in the form of an equity injection as opposed to just making like short-term loans or something that technically don't boost your capital. And that it's, yeah, I couldn't justify it as a free market economist, but at least that makes sense. And that they're going to prop up Intel and just basically sink a bunch of tax dollars into this thing, whereas the people in the private sector, the taxpayers, the citizens with their own money don't evaluate Intel so highly, right? And that's why it wouldn't be efficient from a free market economist point of view. But that's not what they did. This was money that Intel was already getting through various provisions of the CHIPS Act under the Biden administration. They had already been awarded this money. They'd already gotten some of it, but there were still, I think, was it $5.7 billion in one version of chips and then $3.2 billion in this other thing called Secure Enclave. Okay? But they had already been awarded that money. So you can say they shouldn't have been. Okay, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. But my point is just prima facie. What everyone admits and stipulates is what happened is a month ago, Intel's chugging along, minding its own business. All of a sudden, the president of the United States says the CEO is conflicted and must resign. There's no other solution. They go hat in hand to Washington and leave with the federal government now owning 9.9% of the shares And what did Intel get? Did they get an extra infusion of money? No. The Trump administration just said, yeah, the money that you already thought you were getting that the previous administration awarded to you, now we're going to attach a bunch of strings to it. Namely, we own 10% of your company. Okay, so that's not a pleasant turn of events if you're Intel. You just got shaken down for 10% of the company. So again, among other possible lessons here, it's don't you dare put your company within arm's reach of the Trump administration because they might just start grabbing it. Locate somewhere else in a safer jurisdiction, right? Again, there are other possibly offsetting factors that might make you want to locate, but I'm saying this recent behavior is a huge red flag. Okay, another way of seeing it is if some South American political ruler had a lot of populist support, said, hey, I'm looking at these deals that my predecessors cut with these international oil companies, and you guys come in and you've built all your wells and rigs and things like that, and you're pumping out all the oil that my people own. That's not a very good deal for them. So how about you're going to still get all the oil and whatever that you thought you were going to get, and the royalties and stuff will be the same. But on top of that, now we own 10% of your company because, we're running the numbers and that we just think that's fair. That's what we're doing. Is that going to make international capital flow into that country? Or are they going to run for the hills and say, whoa, this guy's a communist. He's just nationalizing companies. So here, and I did see on social media, people pushing back against me. So, oh, they didn't nationalize. They only took 10% share. Okay, it's 10% nationalization. 9.9 if we really want to be precise. Okay, so I hope I've made my narrow point there. And then on the issue that, like I think Lutnick said, hey, we were just, we get in there and we look at this deal. And that was crazy. The Biden administration gave Intel all this money with no strings attached. So we just renegotiated that and now got something for the taxpayer. Who could possibly object to that? I said, the shareholders of Intel, that's who. And if you want to say that the original disbursement shouldn't have happened, okay, I would agree with you. I'm not in favor of the government doling out favors to politically connected corporations. So if you want to undo that, cancel, claw back the money. Don't just say, okay, yeah, we're still going to pay you this money that we don't think we should have, but now we're going to get 10% of the company. That doesn't follow. Since it wasn't voluntary, it's not obvious that actually helps Intel. We're not really sure what they would have done at the outset had they realized what all the conditions were eventually going to be. And again, this isn't that Trump put out in Truth Social, hey, I was looking at this was the worst semiconductor deal of all time that the Biden administration did. And, in the history of bad deals, this is one of the worst. We're going to renegotiate this. Thank you for your attention to this problem. And then they went, and that's not what happened. No, Trump said the CEO needs to resign. And one might ask, how does Trump have the power to make the CEO resign? Okay, and you could think, oh, there's lots of levers that they can come up with. So I don't think, as Lutnick and others were trying to spin, that this is capitalism at its finest. No, this is the furthest thing from capitalism. Okay, let me just make one final point here. Lutnick went on to say that this model that they just deployed here in this Intel case, that they're looking at other companies. And he specifically cited Lockheed Martin. And he said, for example, I've looked over the data and 97% of their revenue comes from federal contracts. And so we're looking, we think the taxpayer, given all the generous support that the U.S. taxpayers have given to Lockheed over the years, we think they should see something for it too. And we're going to look into taking a non-voting ownership stake in it. What's interesting too is like the whole non-voting part. Like a lot of people were thinking, putting a lot of weight on that element of the Intel deal, as if Trump posting your CEO has to resign. You have to fly to Washington to smooth things out, and you leave with 10% of your company now being under federal control, as if that isn't influencing the decisions that your company's going to make, whether or not they formally have votes at the shareholder meeting. That's crazy. All right. But in any event, so let's just unpack that a little bit. Ostensibly, on the surface, right, if the Pentagon has been giving contracts to Lockheed Martin over the years, you say, what are taxpayers getting for it? Presumably military hardware that helps the U.S. win wars. Okay. And so if you say, oh, no, they're not, well, then the solution is not to acquire X% ownership in a company that's selling us defective merchandise or selling us things that, oh, yeah, they work reasonably well, but they're way overpriced. No, the way you fix that especially if 97% of the revenue of this company comes from you as the buyer. If you're saying, yeah, they can float, they can handle us taking a big chunk of the ownership in their company, and that won't affect the quality of the merchandise they sell to us. If that's your position, then that means there's a lot of fat built into those contracts. And so again, the real way you, as a shrewd business person, Howard Lutnick and others in the Trump administration, the real way you would protect the taxpayer there isn't to say, yes, let's continue handing over these humongous pork-filled contracts, but then we at least get 1% of our money back. It's like, getting the card from the department store or something that gives you cash back or something. And no, if you think they're charging ridiculous prices, the real way to deal with that is to negotiate or go somewhere else if you think that they're not going to play ball with you. Okay, so that's really what you would do. So again, there's no way out of this if Lutnick thinks that the U.S. government can take a chunk of equity ownership in Lockheed Martin and that won't adversely impact the quality of the military hardware that Lockheed supplies down the road. Then that means right now Lockheed is charging way more than it should be for that merchandise. And so the better thing for Lutnick to do would be to tell the Pentagon people or the buyers and whatnot, renegotiate these contracts. Don't pay so much because there's a lot of fat here. That's really the way to help the taxpayer, as opposed to continuing to overpay, but then taking more from taxpayers than they need to for the purpose of military defense, but then on the side saying, yes, this excess amount we're taxing from you, we're going to then go invest it on your behalf in companies like Intel and Lockheed Martin and so on. And no, that's the only way you can make this work, unless you're just admitting that, oh yeah, this is government interference with business and that's going to hamper the effectiveness of our combat troops because they're going to be using merchandise that's not as effective because the government came in and screwed around with the companies producing this stuff. If you want to avoid that, you're backed into claiming that, yeah, it makes economic sense for the U.S. government to tax the people more than needs to be the case to provide for national defense. And then on the side, we're going to run a big sovereign wealth fund with extra money that we tax from people. And we'll say that does not follow at all. That's not efficient. That doesn't make economic sense. That if private citizens want to invest some of their money in Lockheed Martin, they can do that. Other people might say, I want nothing to do with that, both for ethical reasons, or they might just say, I don't agree that that's the best use of it. Maybe they want to go invest in Bitcoin and think there's a higher rate of return there. But they're not given that option given the way Howard Lutnick wants to proceed. So say what you will about all this stuff. This is not free market capitalism in action. And the segment of the MAGA folks who at least appreciate the market economy and understand that socialism doesn't work, they should see that here, the way you fight communist China, for example, is not to copy their methods. They say, oh, well, the Chinese government has partnerships with this major firms, so we got to say, no, we don't. That's actually good for the United States. The fact that people who are hostile to us are hampering their ability to compete effectively. Okay, again, it comes down to, do you think socialism works or don't you? All right, well, that's a good place to wrap up. Thanks for your attention, everybody. We'll see you next time.